Right now, off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, two tectonic plates are locked together in total silence. No shaking, no warning signs on the surface, just a slow, invisible buildup of pressure that has been accumulating for more than 3 centuries. And scientists who have spent decades studying this fault have arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. It is not a question of if this fault ruptures, it is a question of when, and the geological clock says that when is overdue. This is the Cascadia subduction zone, and it is widely considered the most dangerous fault in the United States. Not because it is the most active, not because it produces frequent earthquakes, but because of exactly the opposite. It stays silent for centuries, storing enormous amounts of energy, and then releases all of it at once in an event so catastrophic that scientists simply call it the big one. Let's start with where this fault actually is, because the geography of it is what makes the threat so serious. The Cascadia subduction zone stretches for roughly 600 to 700 miles along the Pacific coast of North America, running from northern Vancouver Island in British Columbia down through Washington and Oregon to Cape Mendocino in northern California. Offshore, about 70 to 100 miles from the coast, the Juan de Fuca plate is sliding underneath the much larger North American plate. That process is called subduction, and it is the same basic mechanism responsible for some of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded on the planet. Here's how it works. Where the two plates meet, roughly 18 miles or less below the surface, friction locks them together. They stop sliding smoothly and instead get stuck, like two rough surfaces jammed against each other. But the plates themselves don't stop moving. The Juan de Fuca plate keeps trying to push forward, and because it can't slide past the locked zone, the pressure has nowhere to go except into the rock itself. Over years, decades, centuries, that stored elastic energy keeps building. The coastline above it gets slowly bent out of shape, like a ruler being flexed further and further in your hands. It doesn't look dramatic day to day. You wouldn't notice it happening if you lived right on top of it. But it does not stop, and it does not relieve itself gradually. Eventually, the locked section fails all at once, and everything that was stored over that entire span of time gets released in a matter of minutes. That is called a megathrust earthquake, and it is the most powerful category of earthquake that exists on Earth. To put the scale in perspective, every time an earthquake's magnitude increases by a single number on the scale, the energy released is roughly 32 times greater. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake releases about 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 7.0, and roughly 1,000,000 times more energy than a magnitude 5.0. Cascadia is capable of producing an earthquake in that top tier, magnitude 9.0 or above, which places it in the same category as the most destructive earthquakes ever recorded on the planet. We know this because it has already happened, and scientists have been able to reconstruct the story of the last one in remarkable detail. On the night of January 26, 1700, Cascadia ruptured in a magnitude 9 earthquake. At the time, the Pacific Northwest had no written historical records the way Europe or Asia did, so for centuries, nobody knew exactly what had happened or when. What existed instead was an indigenous oral tradition passed down for generations, describing an epic battle between a thunderbird and a whale. In the story, the thunderbird's wing beats make the ground shake, and the whale's thrashing sends seawater flooding inland. Researchers now believe this legend is a cultural memory of the actual 1700 earthquake and tsunami. The physical proof came from an unlikely place, Japan. On the same night as the earthquake, a tsunami with no local earthquake to explain it struck the eastern coast of Japan. For centuries, nobody connected the two events. It wasn't until 1980s and 1990s that researchers put it together. They matched the timing of the orphan tsunami in Japanese records to the earthquake in the Pacific Northwest and confirmed it using dead cedar trees along the Washington coast that had all perished in the same season, their growth rings dating precisely to the winter of 1700. An earthquake, aches with no witnesses on one side of the ocean, had left its fingerprint on the other side 300 years later, still readable in tree rings and old records. That reconstruction gave scientists a single confirmed data point, but a single data point T wasn't enough to understand the pattern, so researchers went looking for more, and what they found is the part of this story that should genuinely concern anyone living in the region today. Teams of researchers sent robotic submarines down to scan the seafloor off the Pacific Northwest coast in extraordinary detail. They expected to find a simple crack marking the fault line. Instead, they found something that looked more like giant underwater steps, some as tall as 33 feet, roughly the height of a 3-story building. Steps like that only form when an enormous piece of the seafloor breaks loose and slides all at once, not gradually. Each of those ruptures also kicks off a mud avalanche, sediment, collapsing and resettling on the ocean floor in a fresh layer. Picture shaking a jar of dirt and water violently and watching a new layer settle at the bottom. Every one of those layers is effectively a timestamp for a massive earthquake. When scientists counted and dated those layers, they found evidence of at least 10 separate megathrust earthquakes stacked on top of each other, going back thousands of years. That tells us something important about how this fault behaves. Cascadia does not release its pressure in small, frequent earthquakes the way some fault systems do. It locks up for a long stretch of time and then breaks violently, all at once, over and over again throughout its history. Based on that geological record, scientists estimate the average interval between major Cascadia earthquakes at somewhere between 200 and 500 years, with some studies putting the range even wider, from 200 to as much as 1,000 years across the full fault length. The last major rupture was in 1700. That means we are now more than 320 years into the waiting period. Depending on which estimate you use, that puts the Pacific Northwest somewhere in the middle of its typical cycle, or well past due for the next one. The United States Geological Survey has put actual numbers on this risk, and they are worth sitting with. There is roughly a 10 to 15% chance of the full, worst-case megathrust rupture, the big one, happening somewhere along this fault in the next 50 years. That might sound low, but compare it to a smaller, still highly destructive earthquake along the same fault, and the odds climb to roughly 1 in 3 within the same 50-year window. These are not lottery ticket odds. These are odds serious enough that emergency planners across 3 states and part of Canada organize their entire disaster response strategy around this single geological feature. So what actually happens when it ruptures? Scientists have modeled this in detail, and the picture is severe in every direction at once. The shaking itself would last somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes on the west coast, in comparisons to other historical subduction earthquakes, such as those in Chile in 1960, Alaska in 1964, Sumatra in 2004, and Japan in 2011, suggest ground motion could persist for 6 to 10 minutes in the most extreme case. That is an extraordinarily long time for the ground to be moving violently. Most earthquakes people have experienced last 10 or 20 seconds. 5 to 10 minutes of continuous violent shaking is enough time for structures that survive the first 30 seconds to fail by the 4th minute simply from cumulative fatigue. While the ground is shaking, the coastline itself changes shape permanently. Geologists S call this co-seismic subsidence, and it means the land along the coast can drop suddenly by 6 to 8 feet in a matter of minutes. Imagine standing on a beach as the shaking finally stops, and then realizing the ocean is rushing toward you, not because of an incoming wave, but because the ground you are standing on has physically sunk below sea level. That single mechanism is enough on its own to shove huge volumes of water out of position and set a tsunami in motion. And the tsunami is where the true scale of this event becomes almost impossible to overstate. When the seafloor suddenly lifts or drops during a megathrust rupture, it displaces an enormous column of water instantly, and the water has to go somewhere. Out in the deep ocean, the resulting wave can travel at speeds of 500 to 600 miles per hour, fast enough to cross from New York to Detroit in about an hour. In open water, it may be barely noticeable, a gentle swell a ship could pass under without realizing anything happened. But as it approaches shallow coastal water, the wave slows down and piles up, growing from something imperceptible into something that can stack tens of eat high, and in the most extreme modeled scenarios, run up to as much as 100 feet on land. For coastal communities, the warning time is brutally short. In some areas, a tsunami generated by a Cascadia rupture could arrive in as little as 10 to 15 minutes. Which is why emergency officials are blunt about the reality. If you are on the CE host and you feel strong, prolonged shaking, that shaking is the warning. You do not wait for a text alert, a siren, or a news broadcast to tell you a tsunami is coming. You move to high ground immediately, and that decision needs to be made now while you're calm, not in the middle of an emergency. Off. Heischels also stress a detail that surprises people. Don't get in your car. Roads will likely be jammed or already damaged, and bridges may be compromised. Getting to high ground on foot along a route you've already scouted is the reliable option. The aftermath, for anyone who survives the initial quake and tsunami, is its own extended disaster. Modeling by emergency planners suggests roughly 600 entoumateroaptus. 20,000 buildings across the affected region could be damaged or destroyed, including around 100 hospitals and roughly 2,000 schools. Interstate 5, the primary north-south highway artery for the entire west coast, would likely have multiple bridges destroyed along its length. Airports would be shut down. Gas pipelines would rupture in numerous locations, and restoring them could take anywhere from a few days in inland areas to weeks or even months along the hardest-hit coastal stretches. Power could be out for weeks across a 100-mile band along the coast. Water service could be disrupted for 3 to 7 months in the worst affected communities. Telecommunications could remain due in for 2 to 3 months, not just locally, but across a swath of the Pacific Northwest, into Alaska, and even affecting connections to parts of East Asia, since many undersea data cables run through this exact region. Geography does offer one piece of good news. Eastern Washington and eastern Oregon are shielded by natural terrain. The Cascade Mountain Range absorbs a significant amount of the earthquake's energy before it reaches the state's interior, which means the eastern half of these states would likely avoid the most severe shaking. Even a tsunami pushing into the Columbia River Gorge would lose much of its force quickly, due to a sandbar baying aft the river that disrupts the wave's energy. That geographic split matters enormously for disaster response, because Ian's, the eastern parts of these states, largely spared the worst damage, would need to become the staging ground for relief efforts. Fairchild Air Force Base near S.B. O'Kane and Grant County International Airport in Moses Lake have both been identified as key staging areas for bringing in supplies and coordinating aid, precisely because they sit outside the primary damage zone. Casualty estimates vary depending on the model, but one widely cited planning estimate puts the toll, if the earthquake and tsunami were to strike without any additional warning improvements, at over 13,800 deaths and roughly 107,000 injuries, with an economic toll across Washington, Oregon, and California potentially exceeding $70 billion. For context on what a magnitude 9 event of this kind actually means for human life, the 1960 Chile earthquake, a T magnitude 9.5, the largest ever instrumentally recorded, killed around 1,650 people. The 1964 Alaska earthquake, at magnitude 9.2, the most powerful ever recorded in North America, killed around 140 people directly but permanently altered the landscape, lifting some coastlines near Kodiak and Hinchinbrook Island by as much as 30 feet, while land elsewhere sank by up to 8 feet, and it produced a 27-foot tsunami that wiped out the entire village of Chiniga. The 2004 Sumatra earthquake and tsunami at magnitude 9.1 killed an estimated 230,000 people across multiple countries, because the region had essentially no tsunami warning infrastructure at the time. The 2011 earthquake and tsunami off Japan, also magnitude 9.1, killed over 20,000 people, despite Japan having one of the most sophisticated earthquake monitoring and warning systems on the planet, and directly triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster. That last comparison matters, because it demonstrates something sobering. Even world-class earthquake infrastructure does not eliminate the danger of a megathrust event. It reduces it. Japan's system, built from lessons learned across a country that experiences roughly 1,500 noticeable earthquakes every year, still could not prevent tens of thousands of deaths. In 2011, the Pacific Northwest, an area that has not experienced a Cascadia-scale event in the modern era of engineering and infrastructure, has never had to test its systems against a real event of this magnitude, which raises the obvious question: what is actually being done to prepare? Scientists are watching this fault more closely than ever before. Researchers have received significant new funding, including more than $10 million, for a project installing seismic sensors and seafloor pressure gauges along fiber optic cables off the Oregon coast, specifically to detect the earliest possible signs of movement and issue warnings before the worst shaking or the tsunami arrives. Elsewhere, engineers are re-studying something called slow slip events, in which sections of the fault release tiny amounts of built-up pressure over weeks or months without producing a major earthquake. These slow slip events don't release nearly enough energy to prevent the big one, but tracking them gives scientists a clearer real-time picture of how stress is distributed across different sections of the locked zone, and some researchers believe patterns in slow slip activity could eventually serve as an early indicator that a larger rupture is approaching. On the built environment side, building codes across Washington, Oregon, and California have been steadily updated to require stronger structural standards, particularly for critical infrastructure like hospitals and schools, and for older buildings that predate modern seismic codes. Retrofitting programs are underway, though they remain incomplete across the region. Bridges along critical routes are being reinforced. Emergency planners run regular drills simulating the exact multi-week to multi-month disruption to fuel, water, food, and communications that a real Cascadia rupture would cause, precisely because a disaster on this scale would isolate entire communities for far longer than most people are used to preparing for. For individuals living in the region, the guidance from officials is consistent and practical. Have a go bag ready with food, water, medication, and supplies for at least 2 weeks, not the standard 3 days recommended for smaller disasters, because roads, airports, and supply chains across the entire region could be disrupted simultaneously. Know your evacuation route to high ground and physically walk it in advance, because during an actual event, roads will likely be blocked, and while you may not have a vehicle available to you, Secure heavy furniture and appliances in your home to reduce injury risk during the shaking itself. And most importantly, understand that if you are on the coast and you feel strong, sustained shaking, that is the warning system. You do not wait for confirmation. It's worth being clear about what scientists are and are not saying. Nobody can predict an exact date. The historical interval B between Cascadia's major earthquakes spans a wide range, and there is no reliable way, even with all of today's monitoring tech. 5 years away or 80, what scientists can say with confidence is that the fault is locked, that pressure has been accumulating without release since 1700, that the geological record shows this exact pattern has repeated at least 10 times over thousands of years, and that every year without a rupture is a year in which more stored energy has to eventually come out. That combination, a known mechanism, a well-documented story, and an overdue timeline is why researchers describe this not as a remote possibility, but as a near certainty on a long enough timeline, and why federal, state, and local agencies plan for the Cascadia megathrust as the most significant natural disaster risk the United States faces. The Pacific Northwest today is nothing like it was in 1700. Millions of people now live directly across the region a magnitude 9 earthquake would affect, from Vancouver Island through Seattle, Portland, and down into Northern California. Cities, ports, highways, pipelines, hospitals, and power grids that did not exist 300 years ago now sit directly on top of a fault that has already demonstrated 10 separate times in the geological record that it does not release its energy gradually. It stores it for centuries, and then it lets go all at once. The last time that happened, nobody was there to record it, except the ocean itself, carrying the evidence to the other side of the Pacific. The next time it happens, tens of millions of people will be standing directly on top of it. Scientists cannot tell you when. They can tell you with as much confidence as this kind of science allows that the wait is already longer. And most of this fault's own history suggests it should be. Whether that means the rupture is years away or decades away, the fault itself does not know and does not care. It only knows how to store energy, and it has been storing it, uninterrupted, since before the United States existed.